We return now to the congressional testimony of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. She was questioned by the House committee overseeing her department about President Trump's declaration of a national emergency to fund a wall at the southern border, as well as the administration's policies for family separation and housing of migrant children. Nicole Killian has the details from Capitol Hill.
Please raise your right hand.
Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen told lawmakers there is an emergency on the southern border that can only be fixed with a border wall.
We need a barrier. We cannot take operational control of the border without it.
Customs and Border Protection reported February numbers showing the highest total of undocumented immigrants crossing the border in 12 years. Families with children made up more than half of those detained.
We're on pace for over 700,000 crossings this year. That's closer to historic highs than historic lows.
Democrats pressed the Trump administration officials on the zero-tolerance policy that resulted in family separations at the border.
You knew that that policy was going to result in children having to be taken away from their parents. That's a policy. You should admit it.
The consequence of any adult going to jail in this country is they're separated from their child.
You said that you waited to give direction on how to implement the zero-tolerance policy because you wanted to do it with compassion. Do you know how outrageous that sounds?
Next week, the Senate is expected to vote on a House-passed resolution blocking President Trump's national emergency declaration to get border wall funding.
A vote against the president's emergency declaration is a vote against border security.
President Trump took to Twitter Wednesday urging Senate Republicans to stay united in opposing the resolution. Nicole Killian, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Joining me now is Houston Chronicle immigration reporter Lomi Kriel. She is at the forefront of reporting on the separation of families at the border. Lomi, thank you so much for joining us. First, I'd like to get your thoughts on these hearings overall. What are the biggest questions the testimony has raised for you?
Well, the Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen today faced a lot of questions, again, about whether the department had a family separation policy. And as she has said before, she kept saying they didn't have such a policy, that they were simply enforcing the law of prosecuting adults for crossing the border illegally. But as the chairman of the committee said, it's a little bit of verbal gymnastics because enforcing such a policy meant parents and children would be separated.
Well, there's a clip I'd like to play from when Secretary Nielsen was asked about the parents who were deported from the U.S. without their children. Let's listen to that.
I would also just note that, consistent with longstanding practice in the law, before we deport any alien after they have gone through the process and receive a final order of removal, we do ask them if they would like to take their children with them. At that same time, their consulate or embassy, for purposes of issuing them travel papers, also asks them, would you like to be removed with your children as you're removed? As part of Miss L, the judge also asked us to go back and ask the parents again in conjunction with the ACLU, which we did. So there was no parent who has been deported, to my knowledge, without multiple opportunities to take their children with them.
So Secretary Nielsen says that no parent was deported without multiple chances to take their children with them. The ACLU, who Nielsen mentioned in that clip, objected to this. Can you just tell us, Lomi, why the objection and what are the facts, as we know them, show regarding this particular issue?
Right. So that's just simply not true. Before the judge's order in the Miss L case, many parents were deported without their children, often without even knowing where their children were. I personally spoke to at least 3 such parents. One father was deported without his 18-month-old toddler and had no idea where he was for 3 months.
So there's a pair of clips that I'd like to play where the Secretary was asked about the facilities the government uses to house children and adults in detention centers.
Yes or no, are we still putting children in cages?
To my knowledge, CBP never purposely put a child in a cage if you need a cage like this.
Purposely or whatever, are we putting children in cages as of today?
Children are processed at the border facility stations that you've been at Some of the
And I've seen the
areas-
cages. I just want you to admit that the cages exist.
Sir, they're not cages.
What are they?
Areas of the border facility that are carved out for the safety and protection of those who remain there while they're being processed. If we have two gangs, we separate them into separate areas of that facility. If we have a father and daughter, we separate that from another son.
What is a chain link fence enclosed into a chamber on a concrete floor represent to you? Is that a cage?
It's a detention space, ma'am, that you know has existed for decades.
Does it differ from the cages you put your dogs in when you let them stay outside? Is it different?
Yes.
In what sense?
It's larger. It has facilities. It provides room to sit, to stand, to lay down.
So did my dog's cage.
So, Lomi, give us some context here. What's the significance of this debate about cages versus detention areas?
So those photos that came out, some that were actually from the Obama era, from CBP processing facilities, helped also to raise a lot of fear and anger about what was happening. And Secretary Nielsen and DHS has consistently pushed back that these are cages, but I mean, you can see the images for yourself. Children, just to be clear, are held in these facilities usually not for longer than 72 hours before they then go to detention centers that are more outfitted for children.
All right, we'll continue to watch it. Lomi Kriel of the Houston Chronicle. Lomi, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.